everybody, it's Claire here from Sewing by Claire, and are we ready for the next part, part 5 in our sew along for the Marcel dress. In the last part we made the band, this top band just here, and we made the straps and they're all ready to go. And then this time we are going to be working on the tiered side panels here, and we're going to make 2 at the same time, so that's going to be an interesting lesson or example in organisation, and how that can just help you not lose your way and to feel far more confident with your sewing. So what I'm going to do is turn the camera down, and we're just going to have a quick look at the line drawing of the pattern first, so I can sort of point out some landmarks, if you like, that will help you just stay organised and stay feeling as if you're in control, because I think that feeling as if you're in control is a big part of sewing, and until you can start to look at the different parts of the pattern and recognise them in their flat form so that you know which bit you're working on and which bit you need next, then it can sometimes be a little bit daunting. So I've got you, I've got your hand, we're going to take it slowly and we're going to take it step by step. And the good thing about doing these side panels is that once you've learnt the technique that is needed to do the gathering, which is the main technique we're going to be using, then it's just rinse and repeat for all of those tiers. But I'm going to hold your hand, we're going to get there, and we're going to make this dress, a beautiful dress, a reality for you and for your wardrobe. So let me turn the camera down and we'll get started. Okay, so I've just got the line drawing out just so we can talk this through. This is the section that we made last time, this top band and these straps here. And now what we're going to do is we're going to be working on the 5 tiers down the sides here. And obviously if you're making the shorter dress, then you'll have fewer tiers, but the instructions are still the same. What I want you to notice is that each tier, apart from the first one, is so let's go on to the second one instead, is gathered on the top edge here, but then is flat on the bottom edge here. So that tells us we only need to add gathering stitches to this top panel and to the top edge of each of the 5 panels, okay? And that will then make it easier to understand the sections as I do next, because while we've got the machine set up for gathering, excuse the road noise, we're going to be gathering these panels, or at least putting the stitches in for gathering those as a preparation step first. So that's what I want you to notice, is this panel here is flat, this one has gathering at the top, this one has gathering at the top, gathering at the top and gathering at the top, and that's the same for both sides. So whilst the machine's set up, we're going to do all of those together so that they're all then ready, and then we'll do that first before then attaching them to each other. And when we attach them, we're going to start with our very top panel, and we're going to attach our second tier to the top tier first on both sides. Then once we've done that, then we'll move down and we'll do the next section and attach that onto the panel. And at the end of the day, we're going to end up with your 5 panels, both of them, all gathered and all sewn together so that they're all ready then for attaching onto these centre panels. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Let's get started. So the first thing that I'm doing is grabbing my pile of my fabrics, and this is the one that we separated out into all the tiers. So I've got my front panel, the long centre front panel, and the long centre back panel, they're still out of the way, so we've got those just put to one side. But what I want you to do now is just take your panels and make sure that you've got your writing on the side up and keep your pattern on the side up. So this is my tier 1, the shaped one, so let me put that face down on my work surface. I've then got tier 2, and I've folded the pattern so that I can see the writing, so that I can see that easily. Tier 2. Let's have a look at this one. This is side, oh no, that's a side, does that say, that's side 4. Sorry, this one's side 2. See how you can get mixed up? So just put them together like that. So that's tier panel 2. This one's 3, so let's just fold that one the other way round so I can read that. 3. This one's 4, and then this one's 5. Okay, and I'm putting that face down so that now when I turn them all over, I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, and I know where I am with those. So those can just go to one side at the moment. The other thing to make sure at this point is that you've got all of your notches marked. So you need to make sure that those are all marked onto your piece of fabric. Now, you may think that with it being a viscose fabric that it frays really easily, and you'd be right, it does, as we can see on the edges here. At this moment in time, I don't want you to neaten it, because if you put all of these pieces through the overlocker now, you're going to bunch up or create bulk on the seam lines, because those seam lines are all going to be gathered. And so what we will do is at the end, we will then save some time and some thread by overlocking or neatening the edges all in one go at the end, at the end of the side tiers anyway for that section. But in doing so, it actually helps to flatten the seam down where the gathers are. And you'll see what I mean by that as we get into this. So just handle your fabric pieces carefully. Try and minimise the rubbing on them or the pulling on them. It's going to be a little bit difficult as we move on, but we'll work with that as we can, because this fabric will fray anyway as we're working with it. But we just want to just try and treat it gently so we don't make it fray too much. But as I say, don't jump ahead and start an overlock or zigzag or neaten the edges now, because we need to keep them all intact. So we know that on the first one there's no gathers, so we can put that one to one side. That one's been done. Just make sure you've got all of your notches on. So the first one that we're going to be working with is tier panel 2. Okay, so let's just get that one to one side, and then we're ready to start and work on this one. The second, and then we're going to work on each of them in turn before we sew them all together. So let's talk about the machine. So when you're gathering stitches, and if you're a beginner, what I would recommend you do is actually change out both your bobbin and your top thread for a different inexpensive thread. You need to have something that's fairly robust, so any old thread isn't good, because you need it to be strong, because we're going to be pulling on this to gather all the stitches up. But it certainly doesn't need to be your best thread. So I mean, I use moon thread for doing my general stitching, and I was given some threads when I bought my sewing machine, and they're still going strong. But I try to choose a colour that is either quite nice and bright or that isn't in my actual garment anyway. So let me have a quick look and see what I'm going to choose. So I'm taking out my bobbin and my top thread, and let me just choose a thread colour, and then I'll come back to you and show you what I've chosen and how that looks against the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to choose this bright luminescent yellow thread. The reason why I've chosen this one is it's a colour that I'm unlikely to use when I do my general sewing, so therefore I don't feel it's wasted, it's being put to good use, because all of this thread that is used for the gathering will be thrown away. So, you know, it's one you've got to not be too precious about. And if I hold that against the back of this fabric here, I can see that fairly clearly on there across a selection of all the different kind of colours. That's no trouble at all. So the other colour I could have used is this orange as well, because there's no orange in this garment at all, and so again that one would show up, but I did think that the yellowy green would show up slightly better, so that's the one that we're going to use today. But just to give you an example of why I've chosen the colours and what I have, because we want to be able to see that gathering thread, but it's not going to stay in there, so it doesn't matter that it's a contrast at all, and we'll talk about how to work with that. So let's put that's tier 1 down there. Let me get my machine just set up for the thread colour that I'm using, and then we'll talk about what stitch length and tension we need to use. So I've got my thread and my bobbin in now, and now we're going to set our machine up for a gathering stitch. So with a gathering stitch, we want something that has quite a long stitch length so that it's not too difficult to gather up, and also we want to reduce our tension so that the stitches aren't quite so tight in holding the fabric together, because when we gather we just go through one layer of fabric at a time. When we're just certainly in this case, and in the majority of cases, you're usually gathering one one length of fabric against a flat length of fabric. So one length of fabric will be longer, and you're compressing the length of that in order to fit onto a smaller piece. So think of a gathered waistline on a skirt, which is in effect what we're doing with this, is that you'll have your bodice of your skirt will be flat, or your dress will be flat, and then you'll have a gathered skirt that you put onto it. So when you're going through the skirt to gather it, you're only gathering that one length, one thickness of the skirt fabric, which is again what we're doing here. So we don't need that tightness of thread and stitch, because we want to pull those stitches along. And the thing, if you've never done gathering before you work onto your main garment, just get a scrap of your fabric and we can work on that. So let me get a little scrap of fabric that I've got here. So we can just test our machine first. I've just got a length of the scrap fabric just to work with. And so you just want to make sure as well, just give your thread a bit of a tug, because you need it to be able to take quite a lot of tension before it breaks. And if you've got an old thread or thread that's been in the sunlight, then that sometimes the ultraviolet light can deteriorate thread. So just check that as well before you actually start stitching with it, to make sure that's okay. I'm happy with my thread. So I'm going to use a straight stitch. And there are different ways of gathering. People gather over dental floss and all sorts of things. But let me show you the traditional way, not the traditional way, but a traditional way, in order that this is the one that's always worked really well for me. So that's the one we're going to go with. But I just do recognise that there are other ways of gathering, and you may have a preferred method of gathering already. And if you do, feel free to use that. That's no problem at all with me, but I'll just show you my way. So what I will do is I'm on a straight stitch, and I'm going to change the stitch length up to a number 4. So that's going to move the fabric through the machine quite quickly when we're gathering, which is great when you've got long lengths of panels to do. But also it means that the gathers are going to be quite will be nice and even, but they won't be too tiny either. So if you're making a child's dress, you might want to have a lower gathering stitch length, but if you're doing an adult dress, then you might want to go with something bigger. And I mean, my maximum stitch length is 5, and there's no problem with gathering on 5 either, but I've just found that over the years I just prefer a number 4 on my stitch length. So my normal construction length for a stitch is 2.2, and so I've increased it to a 4 to use for my gathering stitches. So that's the first thing, is your stitch length. Then we want to release how tight those stitches are together, and to do that we have to release the tension. And so I've got a tension dial on my machine just here, and you'll have something, but with tension you've got 2 discs that sit side by side, and depending how high you have your tension, the tighter those discs will hold on to the thread and will slow its passage down through this section of the machine here and down through to your needle. So if we release that off, and I'm going to release mine off to about a 2, I think, and we'll try that and see how that goes, but you can go down even lower. If you go too far down, you can get knots on the back of your gathers, and we don't want that, because that will stop the free flow of the thread through the stitches, and that's what we want. We want that ability to just bunch all that fabric up together. So let's work with our scrap piece of fabric first. And the other thing that we want to do is we want to bear in mind, so we've got a 1 centimetre, where's my seam gauge gone? We've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance on our machine, on our panels, on our pattern. So what we want to do is make sure that we have we're going to do 2 rows of stitching on every single panel. And what we want to make sure that we have one that's really maybe an 1/8 of an inch from the top, and then so that's that's before your seam allowance, and then we want another one that's probably just after your seam allowance. And you'll see why that's important, because when we go through the 2 channels of the gathering, we want to stitch between the 2 channels. It'll all make sense. Just hang on a minute and just let me explain it all, and then it'll all make sense. So this piece is fairly straight. It's not perfectly straight, but it'll do to demonstrate. So I'm going to move my needle across as well, so that it's towards the top edge of my presser foot, because then I can use the edge of my presser foot. So I'm at position 7 for my needle. So then I can put my fabric into my machine, I can find my pedal, and then I'm just going to start towards the edge. I don't reverse at the start and the stop, and you need to have some threads at the end of your stitching line. So if you've got a machine that automatically cuts your threads, you need to switch that off at the moment because you need some threads to pull at either end. So let's just sew this along here. It's nice and straight, just guide the fabric using the edge of your presser foot. Try not to run your fingers along this seam as well because you'll pull all of your threads out. So just try and let it just kind of go through the machine just nicely. I went a bit close to the edge there, but you'll get the idea. And then I've just left a length of threads at the end. So then I'm going to put this same piece back into the machine, and I'm going to now put my presser foot against that edge, that line that I've already sewn. So I want a gap between these two stitches, these two rows of stitches, where my 1 centimetre seam allowance is going to fall in the middle from the edge of my presser foot. Yeah, that's fine. So let's just do that. I'll explain it all in a second. So I'm now running the edge of my presser foot against the first line of stitches that I did. And towards the end, leave some length. So this is what it looks like from the top. You can see those 2 rows of stitches just there. And then from the back, the stitch is quite loose and loopy. So then what we have to do then is I tend to use Quick Unpick or something or the awl, because these threads here have sort of tangled round each other, and what we need is we need the 2 top threads. So I just put my Quick Unpick between the threads, and that will just separate them out between the top and the bottom threads. So there's my 2 top threads and there's my 2 bottom threads. Okay, because then what we can do is we can hold on to these top threads and then we can just pull gently, and that thread will just, the fabric will just bunch up. Can you see how I'm just gripping the fabric with my finger and my thumb quite close to the edge? And it's a bit like if you're gathering curtains up. If you've ever gathered curtains up, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but if you can just hold it still with these with this hand here on the threads, and then you just pull. And look how it all bunches, oh, let me get my hands right, how it all bunches up. And what we want is we want those threads to move through those stitches really well. My bottom threads are just hanging loose, don't worry about those, because then if you hold on to your threads and kind of lock those off with your hand, you can then manipulate these gathers further down to get your spacing. And you can have something that's really tightly bunched up together, like that. Or you can spread those gathers down and you can have something that's really quite loosely gathered. And if we're gathering like a sleeve head top, we'll use a really loose gather just to take a little bit of that excess fabric up. But on these panels, they'll have a little bit more kind of gathering. And I always as well go to the other side, so I don't gather all the way from one side to the other. I tend to gather in towards the middle. So again, separate out those threads just using a point of some sort, and then holding onto your threads, and you can then just gather these up. Just making sure, you see how it's folding over at the top just there. You want to try and keep an eye on that, and just make sure that everything, you've still got your top edge in place. So we can pull those gathers in towards the middle. So I just want you to have a little practice doing that, because if you've had to practice before you're actually onto your fabric, then you'll feel a bit more confident. If your threads are not running along the fabric correctly, you need to loosen off your tension a little bit more. Or if you feel the gathers are too coarse, if you like, and not fine enough, then you need to take your stitch length down and your gathers will become finer, but they will be a little bit more difficult just to gather up. And then we're just making sure that when we sew our stitch length, we want our 1 centimetre seam allowance to fall in between that line of gathers just there. So just use your seam gauge. There's my 1 centimetre just there. And if I use the edge of my fabric, then that edge is going to fall in between that track, those two tracks, if you like, of the gathers, and that's what we want. So you need one before and one after your 1 centimetre seam allowance. Okay, take a breath, have a practice, just see how it goes, and that will really set you up then for having a successful gathering session, because it's going to feel like quite a long session, but we're going to get there. So, happy with our machine now, let's go on to our fabric. And the first thing I'm going to do is, so have your piles. So I've got one pile here with my tiers yet to be done, and I've one pile here with my tier that doesn't need gathering yet, and that's where I will put all of my completed tiers once I've put my gathering stitches in. So let's take our pins out of our pattern piece. And yes, I should have done this before I came on camera. Just before you remove your pattern completely, just make sure that you've got your notches marked onto, so there's on the tier 1, there's just 1 on this top edge, and then there's 3 on the bottom down here. So just make sure that your notches have gone through each of your pieces of fabric that you need to do clearly enough to see. So just put that pattern piece to one side just for a second, and we've got both of our pieces of fabric. You need to remember which side is up and which side is down, and the way that I do that is I will take a pin and I will just feed it through the top edge of both of these 2 pieces of fabric on the right side. So again, if you've got a fabric that's plain or that looks very similar to the front and the back, then I would just put a pin at the very top edge. So once we've got those, that's 1, that's 2. So we've got those 2 together now, and we know that's the top edge of our stitching. So now it doesn't matter if we get interrupted or if the telephone rings or whatever, we know which is our upside to keep our pattern consistent all the way down. We've got a little tail for our threads, and now I want you to just go back. So we have to set the machine up. So we're going to do the top row of stitches first. That's at position number 7 on mine. And I'm just going to start there, and I'm going to just run my fabric along the top, the edge of my presser foot. Once you get to the top, you can take your pin out. You can put your needle in your work as well, just to hold it steady. It doesn't matter so much on this. Try and stay as straight as you can. And then when you get to the end, you can lift out your presser foot and you can cut your threads off, okay? So I would do both of these first with 1 run first, because the machine is set up for that. So put in your next piece, because you've got 2 tiers, 1 for each side, 1 for left and 1 for right. And then on that top edge again, move your pin when you get close to it, needle in the work. Just so because we know they only have 1 row, they only have the gathering on the top edge. So now that we've got the gathering stitches in, we know that's the top edge. Allow to the work and leave a tail, okay? So now we can now move our needle position, and we said to 4.5, didn't we, for mine? So position number 4.5 to get that gap between the tracks, and then I'm going to now use my original row of stitches as being my guide, and I run the side of my presser foot against that row of stitches. Right to the end, and then leave a tail. And then just pop that just to one side, because that one's finished now, for now. And now we're going to go on to the next one. And while we've got our machine set up at the same place, we'll take that one off. Okay, I want you then to stack both these pieces of fabric onto your table, with the top side up and right sides up. It doesn't matter which way, whether you've got the right sides or wrong sides together. But then I want you to take your pattern piece again, and I want you to pin your pattern piece through both pieces of the fabric. and then fold it up however you want. I fold my ends in so that I can see my writing, and then you're going to put it face down onto your pile, because that's been done for now. So now we're going to get tier 3. We're going to take our pins out. Let me just come back to you in a second. Just double check as well that you've got all of your snips and all of your notches cut into the right section, that they're big enough for you to be able to see. That's there, that one's there. So on this panel we've got 3 on the top and we've got 3 on the bottom as well. So just make sure you've got all of those marked into your stitches, into your way. That could just be a little bit. And we want to make sure that it's not so deep. Again, this is where it's important. Just put my pattern piece to one side so I can show you. It's important to try not to get your little notches too deep into your fabric, just enough so you can see them, but not so deep that you're going to compromise, because we want the first row of stitching to be just below that notch line really, so that it's not compromised. So again, because we've just taken the pattern off, let's just put a pin through the top edge of our fabric pieces so that we remember which is top and which is bottom for our pattern consistency. Put one to one side for the moment whilst you're working on one. And then at the start of each panel I take it back to my original setting. So now I'm going to put my needle back to position number 7. I make sure I've got the top of my fabric, and I know I have because I've got my pin there. And then now I'm going to line up the top of the edge of my presser foot with the top of the fabric, no reversing, and now I'm going to just run down this top of this panel as well. Get to my pin, just take that out. And we're just going through, just to remind you, just going through one layer of fabric. We're not sewing the 2 of them together, we're sewing those 2 pieces of tier fabric separately. Try and keep it as straight as you can, don't reverse, and then leave a space. If you do reverse by mistake, you will have to, you can probably manage, but it's not ideal, because ideally you don't want to be, it's too much strain on your thread to be starting at one end of your tier and then go into the other. You're better to go from each end into the middle, and it does put less tension on your threads, because if you lose your gathering threads, whilst you're gathering, whether it snaps or whether it's got a knot, a bubble on the back or a nest on the back from the tension being too loose, that is not going to gather up as well. So you'd be as well then to take that row of stitching out and then to start again. Is it essential? Possibly not, but when you're learning, it's best to kind of learn the correct way, I suppose, or a workable way, rather than give yourself problems. And so I think that would probably be easy if you started again. So we've got one row on that one. So while we've got our machine set up for our in needle position number 7, let's carry on. I know it's the top because I've got my pin in there that I can see. So let's now feed that piece of fabric through. And again, you're trying to keep everything nice and straight and even. I'm stopping when I get to my pin, it comes out really easily. And then leave your tail. Then we're going to move our needle back to position 4.5. And then I can still work on this same one. And then I'm going to put the edge of the presser foot up against the original the stitching line I've just made. And then I'm just going to start off again. And you just try not to pull on your edge to sort of make it too fraying. Just go at whatever speed you're comfortable with. Leave a tail. And then let's get down onto this next one then. So again, lining it up, my needle's in the same position because it's my second row of stitching. And there we can see the stitching again on there. Look, those tram lines of stitching. And that's how it's supposed to look on the back. Not too loopy. You don't want it too loopy. The stitches are loose enough. And then I leave a thread at the end. So again, that's tier 3 that we've just done. So we're going to put those two together with the top edges at the top. Going to put our pattern piece over the top again. We're going to put a pin in the top here to hold the pattern piece and the two pieces of fabric together. And I'm going to fold this in now so that I can still see my writing on the top. And now I'm going to put that face down onto my pile of completed ones. And what I want you to do is do exactly the same with tier 4 and with tier 5, and they get longer each time, but don't worry about that. Just check your notches are in the right position and that you can see them on the top and the bottom if you've got them, you know, if we've got them on the fabrics, so that we've got those. So there's 1, 2, 3 on the top of tier 4 and 1, 2, 3 on the bottom of tier 4. So make sure you've got your notches in place. And take your pins out. Remember to mark the top of your panel so that you know which is the top and the bottom to keep your pattern intact, and also to make sure you've got your right side so that you're always using the same side of your fabric, because sometimes there can just be slight differences and that would be a shame if it were to show. So I'm going to go and put my gathering stitches into both of these panels now. If you can do the same, and I'll meet you back and then we'll look at the next step that we need to take. Okay, so I've just finished doing all of my 5 tiers, so now I'm going to, well, 4 tiers because one didn't need any gathering. So I'm just going to turn them back over again now and just check, just stay in order. So you've got number 1, number 2, tier 3, tier 4 and tier 5, okay? So let's just put those back onto that original pile again, just so we've got that together. The first one we're going to take is our tier 1. And take our pins out. Just make sure again that you've got your notches and you can see those on each of your places. You've got one notch on this top curved edge just here, and then there's another notch down on this bottom edge just here, and I've got both of those. Oh, and we've also got 2 notches on this side panel just here. So just make sure you've got all of those, and you will need your pins because we'll need quite a few pins. Okay. And I've got pins marking the top or the right side, but we don't need that because we know which it is because of this curve. And this is where we're going to start and work on a left and a right. So you can see that as I took one off top of the other, we've got 2 mirrored copies, and I've got them with both of the points going up into this top centre section here. It doesn't matter too much because you've got the shaping and we know which is the right side or the wrong side of this fabric, because one side is duller than the other. If I put that against there, you can see the difference. But this is where you just need to be aware if you're working with fabrics which are the same on both sides, so like a linen or a double gauze, then you might have both something where you've got both sides are the same of your fabric. So when you put them down, you need to make sure you've got a left and a right and that the point is coming up to the top. Because if you start to attach your gathers this way, 1, 2, can you see how those curves are at different ends? So I've got a straight edge here and I've got a straight edge down here on my fabric, and I've got a curved point there and a curved point there. At this stage, that's wrong. You need to have them so that the 2 curved point and the points are together, so almost so touching, if you like, so that they're together, because that will give you a left and a right. So just bear that in mind. So you may have had a pin in to mark which is your right side and your wrong side, and that's fine. So we've got this bit down here, so your pattern piece now can go back into your bag, ready for the next time you make this dress, because hopefully you'll be addicted to it like I am. And then we're going to take our tier 2 first of all. So again, let's take our pattern piece off that, pin out and put your pattern piece away. We know we've already checked the notches on that, so that's good. And we've got our rows of stitching on the top here as well, which tell us which is the top and which is the bottom. So you're just going to allocate at this stage 1 panel. So I'm just going to turn it over so that the 2 rows of stitching are against the bottom edge, because that's where we're going to match. So there's my, I'll just do it again for you. There's my top there. There's my 2 rows of stitching line on there. So I'm going to put this edge here. So I'm putting right sides of the fabric together, and I'm having what was previously the top down onto the hem here. So there's my 2 rows of gathering stitches. The first thing I want to do is look along this centre panel here and find the notch in the middle, and find the notch on my panel of my skirt here, and then we're just going to put a pin to hold that together. Just try not to pierce through any of the fibres in your gathering stitches. So that's how that's looking now, look. So we're just working on one at a time. So if I fold this down now, I can see that this longer edge here is against the shorter edge here, and there's our curved edge at the top. Okay, so you can get your orientation right. So let's just fold that back over again. So we've got a pin holding the notch together in the middle. Let's go to one side and put the cut edge of both fabrics together. And we're going to put a pin in there. So I've not done any gathering at this stage at all. And then we're going to go to the other side, and we're then going to put a pin in just here to hold those together. And you want these edges to be straight, to be level, so that, because when we come to sew these to the panels for the front and the back, then this needs to be straight. So that's what it looks like if I hold it up. You can see these 2 pockets, if you like, these 2 loose bits of fabric. And then if we lay that down back on our work surface, we can take our quick and pick, and we're just going to separate the top 2 threads from the bottom 2 threads. So remember how we talked about that in the practice. So I've got my bottom 2 threads one side and my top 2 threads the other. And I'm going to hold on to the threads that are actually on the bobbin, and then I'm just going to pinch where my pin is, and then pull on my threads that I've just isolated, and that will then start to gather the fabric. As I've gathered it a little bit, I'm then going to hold on to those gathers, and then I'm just going to pull them down towards the centre. So the first thing that we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we gather it. So can you see how this side now is, the non-gathered side is now ballooning out. So I know I've gathered it too tightly. So I can just pull some of those gathers towards those end threads, and that will then even that out for me. And what I want is that when I've got the 2 sides gathered, don't worry that they're not even at the moment, just look at the length of them, that they're roughly the same length. Okay, because then what I'm going to do is take the threads that I've just done, was pulling, and then I'm just going to whichever side you've pinned on, it doesn't really matter, I'll pin on the other side so that you can see what I want to do. Just move your pin over to the other side, because then I'm going to take those longer threads, just the ones we've been pulling on, and then I do a figure of 8 around the pin. So watch the pin, I'm going to go round the top, cross over the middle and under the end of the pin. Round the top, across the middle and under. And what I'm doing is I'm just tying off those threads, because that now is the length that I need for that section. Those 2 pieces of fabric are the same length. Now what we can do is then, just using a fingernail or our fingers, is we just spread those gathers just by pulling on them with our fingers along the line until we've got that even. The gathers are even, and all of that fabric is just gathered up along the edge. It's not gathered that much in actual fact, it doesn't need a lot because we've got the 5 tiers. So that's how mine's looking. And I've gathered as far up to the pin as I can do. You don't want a bold spot or a flat spot where your pin is, so make sure you gather up to there. And then when you've done that, just go to the middle, put those 2 raw edges together for your top of your seam, and then just put a pin through that to hold that steady. And then you put in as many pins as you feel you need just to keep those raw edges together. And we just pin that along that edge just to hold it tight. This does get quicker as you get used to doing it. So there we go. So there's my threads around in the figure of 8 around my pin. There's my pins holding the gathers in place. And this side is completely flat. Okay, so let's go to the other side now. So there we've got our loose bit of fabric with our gathering stitches in along the top. So let's use our quick unpick again. Let me show you just here, nice and close up. All I do is I've got the top thread there and the top thread there, and you're just untangling them. You see how they get entangled on the edge of the quick unpick? And if you do that, you can then just separate those two out. So there's my two bottom threads and there's my two top threads. You don't want a top and a bottom because you won't be able to gather. You've got to have your top thread separate to your other one. The reason why we do 2 rows of stitching as well is because we are going to be stitching when we do in the middle here, and if you have just 1 row of gathering stitches, all of this down here can go a bit skew with your gathers, whereas if you've got 2 rows of stitching to hold it, between those 2 rows, when you run along here with your 1 centimetre seam allowance, you're going to catch each of those gathers down nice and evenly, and that's what we're going to be doing soon, but not just yet. So let's go to this other side. We've separated out our threads. Just make sure you've got your two top separate. Doesn't matter, I'm talking top and bottom, and they're bobbin and top thread are interchangeable, so don't worry too much. But you just want 2 on the same side of your gathers. Just hold on to them with your hand, with your threads, and then finger and thumb, and then just you hold this finger and thumb still and pull on your threads. As you can you see there, look? And then it starts to all bunch up and all starts to gather. So what we want to do now is, I've gone too tight now because I've been showing you, but we can just even those off again. So just pull those gathers back towards your threads that you're holding, and you'll find your way of holding them. You don't have to copy me totally, it's just a way I've just found of holding the threads until you've got them both pieces of fabric the same length. I'm just going to move my pin over on the edge because I pin the other side. So pin on the side of your tier, and then those threads there, just the top ones again, not the bottom ones, just the top ones. Separate them out again. Well, they do like holding on to each other, don't they? So it's the 2 longer ones anyway, which is usually easy to find. And then we're going to do that, not tight on the edge because we don't want to bunch up this section here. And then we're just going to do that figure of 8 across the top of your pin. And that just anchors your threads down and just holds them in the right position. You can easily undo them, either take your pin out or just unwrap them, and you'll be fine. Okay. And then now that we've got that to the correct length, now we're going to pull on those gathers and just pull them down towards the centre where we were at the other point, and just making sure that that just is as even and neat as we can get it. And the ratio, because we've got that notch in the centre, we have already made sure that there's the same amount of fabric to gather one side of the tier as there is on the other side of the tier. So again, let's just even these out just a smidge. Okay, I've got a little bit of a blank spot there, so let me just move that across. Okay, yeah, happy with that. So again then, just put them down on your work surface so it's all lying on top of each other. Find the middle point between your original pins, that's the first point I go to, and put a pin in, and then I'm just putting in one either side and just putting your pins in just in between that gap. Split the difference, you'll have heard me say that before if you watch any of my videos. So we split the difference halfway between the 2 pins we've already got. And again, put in as many pins as you want, and if you're using binding clips, you can use binding clips too. You just won't be able to do the figure of 8 round the pin. So that's what you're going to end up with. Can you see my pin heads at the top there sticking out? That's because then if I put the pin heads down here, then I then can only sew from one side. But if I actually have the pin heads across at the top here, sort of at right angles to where I'm going to stitch, I can work from this side or from that side and it's not going to matter. Okay, so that's one done. Put that to one side now. We've done that. Let's go on to our next one. So let's pop our panel down and let's just make sure that we're getting these right as well. So that's our first one there, look, with the point at the top. I've just folded out the tier for now, so we can make sure that, especially if you're working with the same fabric, that you're not getting yourself mixed up. And don't forget, that's where your pin helps to tell you which is the right side and the wrong side, and you should be fine. So we've got the bottom edge here, the non-curved edge, and now we're going to take our gathered of our tier and get the top with the gathering rows of stitches in and put that against the hem. So again, put your pin in the middle to match that up, and this time I'm putting my pin on the gathering side so that we've got it on the right side for doing that figure eight. Go to the hem on one side and match those two bits up to make sure that they are straight, pin in, and then down to the other end, and then let's match up this other end just down here and put a pin in just there to make sure that that's all level. Then once I've done that, I'm going to take my quick unpick, just separate out my threads so that I can work with those. Just be careful you don't cut off your threads with the blade. I tend to use the back of my quick unpick, not the front, just use the back, and then the threads are running against here, not in that section. So get those together, so you've got those. Hold on to your threads, hold on to your fabric and pull it until you get it to the right length. And you can kind of move your gathers along as you go as well if you want to, that's fine. I sometimes do both. But just slide those gathers along. Once you've got the right length, I just do the quick figure of eight with my threads, so that just anchors that down, and that then gives me the time to be able to move these without losing any of the gathers off the end. Just make sure you've got gathers up towards your pin, otherwise you'll end up with a blank spot in your top of your fabric. And then we're going to then pin in the middle, and then I pin either side of that middle pin that we've just done. And what I'm trying to show you is that whilst I take it slow the first time, you can start to see that you really can speed up with these once you've got them the initial way going. But if I'm going too fast for you on this bit, just rewind the video, and then you'll be able to see how I've done this. I don't want to make the video too long and too laborious for you, but this is basically what we're going to be doing for quite a lot of this session, is just gathering these up. Okay, I don't, just to say before you jump ahead as well, I would recommend that you work on one tier at a time, and we're going to stitch that in a minute as well, before you start and work on your next one. I wouldn't prep all of the tiers at this stage. Let me get my words right. I would prep your gathering stitches into the top of all of the tiers, as we have done before we started to attach them together, but I will go ahead and sew tier 1 to tier 2 properly and get rid of all of those pins before I started to work with my tier 3. Okay, I'm working off screen, aren't I, for you? Sorry. I hope that makes sense, because you want these to be attached properly before you then start to work on the next one. If you want to, oh, no, that's fine. Leave it to that for the moment. Right, okay, so I'm going to do my figure of 8 this side here with my threads. And we've got this next panel organised, so gathered on that side, flat on that side, and just have a look at the back. Just make sure you've not pinned any fabric so that you've got a fold in it or a crease in it. You just want it all to be laying flat. So there's one ready, and here's the other one that we've got pinned ready. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do now is go back to our machine, and I want you to change your thread now away from your gathering thread. Let's take that out for now. We will need it later, so don't put it too far away, but just have it to one side. So I've loaded up my machine again with my white thread, which is the one that I'm using to stitch this dress. Now, the first and most important thing we need to do is, because we've stopped gathering, is we need to tighten our tension up again for our stitches. So I usually have my tension between 4.5 and 5. I'd taken it down to a 2 in order to do my gathering stitches, but now we need it tight again because we're going to stitch these two pieces of fabric together. And my stitch length, I want to take that back up to my 2.2, which is my stitch length that I use for construction. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take our first tier that we've pinned. I'm having the gathered side up because I know that the bottom side should stay flat, and I know that I've checked it to make sure I've not got any puckers in there at all. And then just try and keep your gathering threads out of the way if you can. You're going to line your machine up so that you are just on the edge of your fabric, and the cut edge of your fabric is going to run along the 1 centimetre seam mark that we had before, seam allowance mark that we had before. It should take you in between your gathering stitches, but if you have to run over your gathering stitches in order to keep your seam allowance straight, then you should do so. The most important thing is you keep to your 1 centimetre seam allowance on this sewn edge when we're using this 2.2 stitch length. So the first thing you'll notice is that I'm going to take a couple of stitches forward and a couple of stitches back, and then I'm going to put my needle in the work, just as we always do anyway. Now, the first bit that you're going to notice is that now we've got our fabric anchored, is we can take out that first pin, and you've now got your figure of 8 threads underneath here. And I'll zoom in so that I can show you, because then what I want you to do is just pull on that figure 8 of threads. It'll come undone, and just hold them out of the way just to one side. Put your presser foot back down, make sure you've got your 1 centimetre seam allowance, and now because we reversed that start and that stop, I just want you to move along, okay? What you're trying to do is make sure that your gathers are all lying horizontally against the bed of the machine. You're trying to avoid having your tiers like that. Can you see how that's all pulling towards one side, or that are all pulling towards the back? Try and have your tiers so that you've got them straight out across your bed, so that you're sewing them in effect horizontally. So go a little bit further, keeping to your 1 centimetre, and then stop for your pin and take that out, and then sew a little bit more. Just adjust your fabric, just make sure it's all nice and lying flat. And if you think that you've got a bald spot with your gathers and a bit where it's a bit busy in another area, just use your fingernail just to move those along your lines, and they'll be able to, which is why we've got our gathers up so that we can do this. So let's sew a bit more. I'm going to stop to take that pin out. And then again, I'm just looking at the gathers and just readjusting. It's just fine tuning them. And your presser foot, because it's raised at the front, should go straight over the top of those gathers with no trouble at all. Just a little bit of adjustment there. Just make sure the fabric's all lying nice and flat. And off we go again. We'll stop for that pin. Make sure everything's all lying all nice and straight. Make sure your raw edges are together as well in between your pins. Now coming up to the last pin, so we're going to stop just before it because we've got that figure of 8 of the thread. Just make sure that your edges of your fabric are lying nice and neat on the edge here as well, so that they're going to end together in a nice place. When you get close to that end, just take out the pin, and again just pull on those figure of 8 threads so you unravel them all. And then we're going to sew towards the end, and we're going to reverse. Needle out of your work, and then we can cut the threads. So you just pull your threads back for your gathering stitches so it exposes just the white. This is why two colours really helps. And so what we end up with is this all flat on the back and all stitched just once through, and then our white stitching line is going through between the 2 yellow stitching lines. Okay, so that's what we've done with this one. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to take one of our long threads that we had as the figure of 8, and hopefully they're separate, they're out of the way, and we're going to just pull on it now all the way through. So you're going to pull on that to pull that fabric, that thread all the way through, and it should pull out really nice and easily. Put it to one side, it's going in the bin in a second. And then find your bobbin thread for that one and that will just pull out just as easily. Okay, and then we're going to go onto this one here again, the next one down. So just pulling these one at a time now, pull it all the way through, out it comes, and then there's our bobbin thread, and pull that through too. Should come out quite easily. And then you're just left with your one row of stitches through your fabric, front and back. And if we hold this out like this, we can see we've got the start of our gathered tier then against our flat panel for the top. Okay, so that's how we're doing. I choose not to neaten this at this point. I'm going to use my overlocker at the end when I've got all of my tiers on together. However, if you would like to now go through and just zigzag along the top here, or overlock over the top here, then please do so. Just make sure that if you're overlocking, you need to make sure that you keep your panels out of the way. And when I come to do mine, I'll do a quick session on that, so you might have to flick forward to that session. But that one's done now. So again, we're going to move our gathering threads out of the way, and we're just going to put that one out of the way for now. And we're now going to stitch this one exactly the same way. So let's put that into the machine. You can rewind the video. I'm not going to do that for keep saving time on the video, because otherwise it takes forever to upload. But I'm going to do exactly the same as I did with that one with this one, and I'll come back to you when it's time to attach the next tier at the end, at the bottom, okay? Sometimes when you're trying to pull your threads out from each other, you might find, especially if you've had to stick to your seam allowance and you might have gone over your gathering threads, sometimes the needle on your machine will pierce through the threads that you've used for gathering. And if that's the case, because thread is rolled onto the reels twisted, it's going to then cause you a problem and make you stop, and you're going to be pulling and it's not going to go any further. If you get to that stage, don't keep tugging and so that you snap everything, because that way you could snap your threads on your seam and you might not realise. Instead, where you find that it's stuck, if you take your quick and pick and go to that point and then just cut through one side of your thread, then you'll find that you should be able to pull up to one point and then go to the other and then pull it out from the other side. So in that case then you'd go through on both sides in order to get that out. So again, that would then just give you a small piece that you've taken out, and then you go to the other end of your gathering stitches where you've got your other long thread, and then you'll be able to just pull on that side and it should be able to pull out. Again, if you get stuck from another side because you found another point, just take your quick and pick. Again, with the different coloured thread, you can see which is your gathering stitch. Just cut it very close to where it's been caught, and then you'll be able to either unpick a couple of stitches so it'll give you an edge to pull, or you'll be able to just pull from the other side and get it out. Try not to, see here I've just sewn over the, oh no, that's where it's gathered up. Try not to compromise your stitching line here. But if you do pull too hard and you're fixing your 2.2 white, in my case the white stitching line gets broken, just put it back in your machine, reverse start at the start, go over the gap a little way, about 1 centimetre, and then reverse again, and just reinforce that part or reinstate that stitching line where it's got broken. There's no need to do the whole seam again, there's no need to pull it all out. Just mend the section that you've got and nobody will ever know. Okay, so let me just carry on taking these threads out and then we'll be on to our next tier. So we've got our 2 tiers. Here's one all fixed with a curved top at the top there, and here's the other one with a tiered top at the top there. And if we put these down onto the work surface, onto your cutting mat or your table, whatever you're using, you will be able to see that we've got our 2 pointed edges here, and then our tiers are on the right edge. So just check you've got yours right at this stage, because if we need to make sure that you've got your left and your right, and we know that by the way the points are, and the 2 pointed edges should be together. You could lie those together, and you've got your tiers below that. Okay, so once you've done that, just put one to one side, because we're going to start and work on one at a time now, just to make sure we're working on one side of the tier at each stage, but we won't go on and do all of 3, 4, 5 with one. To stay organised and know where I am, I work on, so now we're going to be working on tier 3. Take my pin out. We've already made sure you've got your notches, and we've got our gathering threads in, so your pattern piece goes away. I then take one piece and pop it with the one that I'm not working on at the moment, put that together. And then I'm going to take my tier that I am working on with the side that I'm working on, and I'm going to put those right sides together so that my rows of stitching, gathering stitches, as at the bottom of that tier. So there's the gathered edge, and we're putting it down onto the bottom here. Locate my centre notch, which is there and there. And the first thing we do is we put a pin in at that point there, just to hold that together. Now we've got extra notches along here, so then I move along from the centre pin and I'll find my next notch, which is there, and then my next notch on the hem, and I'm going to put those two together, and I'm going to put a pin in. And then we're going to go to the ends as we did before, and now we can put a pin in on the end. And then now we're going to do the other side. So now we can see our little loops of fabric that we've got together. So there's a loop there and a loop there, look, and the straight edge here of that's the hem of the previous tier. So let's go along here, find our notches. That's our notch just there, pop that onto there. And I use the same process for all of these tier attachments, exactly the same each time. So then onto the notches just here, onto the end, after we've got the notches and a pin at the end. Okay, so that's what that looks like now with all of those little loops. Just gets bigger, just gets longer and bigger, but it'll feel a bit daunting at first when you first start doing it, but believe me, just follow this process and it really does work. So then I'm going to separate out my gathering threads again, the top from the bottom, and then I'm going to do the same thing again, but this time I'm going to gather past the pin that I was on before and towards the middle. So I start at one end and then I start to move my gathers along to the centre pin, just to here. And so I've gone past one pin here. So I've got a pin at the start, a pin at the quarter-in notch, I suppose, and then a notch at the halfway point. So I'm gathering to that halfway point. Just ease your threads out. Just make sure that you've got it so that so that it's as even as it can be at that point. So I'm not bothering about the start here at the moment. I'm just bothering between the halfway point and then the first pin to the right in my case. Just gather your notch. Just even your knots. I've still got a bit of extra fabric there, so I can do a bit more gathering. So just move a little bit more along until you've got it the same length. Use your fingernail just to move those gathers along to make them nice and even. And then when you've got that even, then I'm going to put a pin in just to hold that together. So that's my halfway pin. That's now, and that was my quarter pin and notch. Just, oops, nearly dropping out. Put it back in again. And because this viscose is really thin fabric, these pins can fall out really easily, which is why you're not going to go and pin all of your layers before you then come back and stitch them. You might think it'll save you time, but I don't think it will, because these pins tend to fall out and then you'll be in a bit of a mess because you'll have to go back and find all your notches again. And then at this section here, I'm just going to move the gathers along until that's nice and even on this piece of fabric. So I've tightened that a little bit too much now, so I'm just going to ease that off towards the end of the gathers, towards the end of the threads. And yeah, I'm happy with that now. So now I've got the right length, I'm going to do that figure of 8 around the pin just to hold on to those threads for me, so I know that it's not going to come undone. Just even out your gathers as you want them to be, and then I'm just going to put a pin in just to hold that section together. So that's one half pinned, and we've still got this half here loose. Okay, so that's the difference. Okay, sorry, excuse my head keep poking in to have a look at the camera. I've got it right in front of me, I should know. So again, let's go to the other end now and then separate out your threads. then pull on those to start the gathering process. We're going to gather past the pin that we've put in already and just take that through. And to do that, you just gather up to the pin and then just change your fingers to the other side of the pin and just pull, and those gathers will just come through to the other side. Okay, that's about right, I think, for that. Just move those along. Then when you're happy that you've got those gathers nice and neat, a little bit more tension, I think. When you're happy with those, that they're all nice and level, then I just put a pin in the middle of that section. But add more if you need to. And then I go to this section here, and I gathered that too much now, so just ease it off a bit at the end. And then I can use my fingernail just to move those gathers along, just to make them nice and even. And you can always adjust these gathers as you're actually stitching it together, so you don't need to worry. So that's that one just there. Okay, and then I'm going to do that figure of 8 round with just the longer threads just around that pin there, just to hold that for me whilst we just do the other one. So that's that section there. So I put that to one side. Now I get this one ready. So working exactly the same way, let's get our orientation. Let's put that down onto the work surface. So we've got our hem, bottom hem of our gathered panel. Remember how we spoke about that at the beginning of the video. And then I'm going to find my middle notch and my middle notch, and let's match those together. And put a pin in. And then I'm going to go to the next notch and the next notch and put that together. And put a pin in. And then I go to the end and put a pin in. Are you bored of watching me do this yet? It's just going to be rinse and repeat now all the way down, and you've just got to if you find your middle section first, you'll make sure that, so if you find your middle pin first by putting it on your middle notch first, get my words right, then that helps you just try and orientate yourself and get yourself organised so you know where you are. And if you get lost completely, just undo all your pins and just start again, and just look along those top edges for the notches, because the other thing that you can do is, if you want to, while everything's in the flat, you can just go through on one section, especially on the longer tiers, and just put a pin by your notches, just through that one single layer. Because then when you come to actually attach this, you've already got your notches marked much more clearly for you to be able to see. And there's another one just there. So can you see those pins across the top there? Hopefully they glint in the sun. Then you've got those pins already marked on your notches, and then it's much easier then to find them on your straighter edge. I do find it's easier to mark the notches before you start gathering than it is to gather it and then, because the gathers tend to hide the notches a little bit. So that also is something that I found, but you've got to find your own way of doing these things. As I said, there's several different ways of sewing. There's no right or wrong way necessarily. There's a right or wrong result, as in you want lovely even gathers along your stitch. You don't want it all your gathering bunched up to one side and nothing here. But so long as you follow those those tips that I've given you, in terms of having your 2 rows of stitching lines and then pinning as you go and then sewing as you go, hopefully it should all come together quite nicely for you. So there's our pockets, as you can see, on those gathers. And then I'm going to separate out these 2 threads just here. Just with my quick unpick, so I've got my top threads and my bottom threads. And then just using one, I'm just going to gather that up and pass my pins. That one's come undone, look. There it is. Gather it past my pins until it's gone onto the longer section. But just make sure you hold on to both sides of your, not both sides, both of your threads, the upper and the lower one, because on your seam edge, just on one side. Because if you try and just gather with one pin, you're not going to manage it. Okay, I just pulled my pin out, put it back in again. Okay, so once I've done this got this one ready, I will then go to the machine and I will sew both of these tiers on, and I will take out both of the lots of thread. Just make sure before you take out your thread that you haven't got any puckers on the side that is supposed to be flat. If you have, just undo your stitches either side of the pucker, and then just even out your gathers, and then just sew over that section again. You don't need to undo the whole seam, just put that little bit right, and again, nobody will ever know. Just make sure you start where your stitches are intact and sew across where they've been broken, and then stitch onto the next section there, and that should then work for you. And just keep your tiers just going along like this. Okay, I am going to come back now when I've got all of the tiers attached, and we'll talk about the next step. Also, just to say, to help you keep organised as well, when you've finished adding one tier, so I've got tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 and tier 4, and I'm about to attach tier 5, just either put your panels side by side or count them as well. Just make sure that you've not inadvertently added an extra panel, because when you go to reach for your next pattern piece and your next tier, then your 2 panels should be right. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. I've just got tier 5 on the end of this one as well. So either by putting them side by side to make sure they're the same length will also tell you the same thing, but it'll just make sure that you don't end up with one tier with only 3 on and one tier with 5 on when you've still got number 5 yet to attach. So I know it sounds like a real, well, of course I'm not going to do that, but I think if we just build in these checks as we go along, then it just helps us be more confident as to where we are and make sure that everything's right. So I'm about to attach tier 5. I've just put these together and I can see that I've got each of my tiers, one on each one, so I know that I'm happy then to carry on. Okay, so that was the other thing I want to say. And as you get further down your dress, you've got more and more fabric to work with, but just push the bulk of it out of the way, concentrate on the bottom of the tier that you've just worked on, and just then put your other tier on the top to work with it. And if you just follow those steps all the way down, even though your tiers are getting longer as you work with them, so it'll feel a little bit more daunting, then just remember those simple steps and just look for your notches and make sure that you're matching your notches up, and that will really help. In order to find your middle tier, don't forget that you can just put the 2 raw ends of your tier together that you're going to be pinning, 2 raw ends together, and then follow it along to the edge, and then there or thereabouts you should then find your notch that you put in there. So that's your halfway point on that one. Let's put a pin on here because I'm working on the very bottom tier now, which is it's a lot of fabric to be working with, especially as a beginner it is as well. But you can do the same with the other tier. Just put your 2 raw edges together and then find your middle point, and that'll make it easier to find that notch before you even start with everything else. Then you can find your pin that you put on your notch from above and then just put that together. So there are, the process is identical, but sometimes there are just little things that you can add in to make it easy as you're going along. So now I would find probably the notch on my on the tier that I've just attached, and then I'd look along the flat edge of my tier above and find my next notch and then put it together. So you're not trying to trawl through everything and then keep adjusting things. You've found a set point, which is the middle, and then you're working out to each edge from that point there. So again, we can then go back to the bottom here, and then we can put the 2 edges together, and we've got that side pinned, ready to gather, and then we will then go to the other side and do exactly the same thing. Even though we're working with a lot more fabric, just find your notch, put your pin in to mark it, and then you're going to look on your top tier until you find your notch, and I can see one just there. And all of this matching up is just really, really useful practice. All of the gathering is really, really useful practice, because quite often when you're learning to sew, you'll pick up a technique and you'll only use it once maybe on that garment, and then you'll move on and you might not do that same technique again for a few different makes if you're making something different. So the fact that you're gathering all of these tiers all in one go and working with the fabric and spreading it all out is absolutely fabulous experience. Next time you have a dress you want to make that's got a straight dress panel and a gathered skirt, you're not even going to think twice about it. You're going to say, no, I know exactly how to do that. I've had lots of practice, and it'll come together really quickly for you. So whilst it's repetitive, just remember that repetitive is just creating those new pathways in your brain as to how to do these things. And doing it several times all in one go is absolutely perfect then to be able to learn that technique and for it to make sense for you and then to move on. So I've got all of those attached now, and then I'm just going to find my long edges and then gather into the middle. Now also on a long tier like this, so I will gather in towards the middle, but where you've got several sections and they're quite big, the other thing that you can do is if you use a pin, it's probably better than your seam gauge, not seam gauge, your unpicker, because sometimes you can damage the threads with the blade of it, is if you just take a pin. So I've got my pin holding my notches together, so on top of that pin there I look for the two threads that go across. So can you see I've got my threads across the needle, and then I can then pull on those threads to start the gather in the middle there. Can you see how that's all gathered up now? And then you can just put your finger through those two threads there. Oops, they're all twisted. Of course they would have done. Right. So they just twist. So just get them so you've got your left and your right one. That's it. Put your finger through, and then you can do the same thing. Then you can gather and pull those up, and then you can pull those along. And again, in the middle there, I just do the figure of 8 around the pin once I've got it to the right length, and to hold those threads still before then. You then take the pin out, undo those threads, and then just run through. You do run the risk though of when you're doing that of crossing over the threads a bit more when you're stitching the actual seam itself. But again, remember those tips, just to sort of snip just before it's snagged, and then you should be able to take those threads out quite easily. Okay, I'll carry on putting on tier number 5, but it's all looking good so far. And if you've had a look, hopefully you're feeling thrilled with how your tiered panels are all looking. I'm pleased with this. Hopefully my mum's going to like it too. And yeah, we're nearly down to the bottom. So back in a minute or two. Another thing that you need to be aware of when you're sewing with long piece of fabric or larger piece of fabric like this is the value of what I call a swoosh. So just every now and again, just stop and just make sure that all the bulk of your fabric is across to the left-hand side of your sewing machine, and that there's nothing folded up underneath, because it's very easy for these longer levels to get folded up, and then you can sew into another level that you shouldn't be. So if you lift up your fabric and make sure that as you're going through, make sure your needle's in your work first, but just lift it all up, just make sure everything that you don't need and don't want to sew is across onto the left-hand side, and that then gives you a lovely clear line here to be working through. So you just make sure there's nothing bunching up, and again making sure that this section here as well, the straight section of the tier above, isn't folding underneath what the work that you're doing. So just take that time every now and again, perhaps when you stop to take a pin out or every second pin, and just make sure that that's all sitting right for you, because then you can carry on sewing with confidence, you know, and just rearrange your fabric, because you're confident then that you've not got anything under there, and that's going to save you some more unpicking time. And when you have to get the seam ripper out, whilst it's not necessarily a negative, if lots of little things start going wrong with you, then it can just knock your confidence, and so you want to give yourself the best chance of success. So just stopping and just taking that fabric out, just making sure everything's all lying flat, is going to be a really good tip for you when you're working with these larger pieces of fabric. Okay, and so very soon you'll end up with 2 panels that look like this, that have got all the tiers in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's our first panel, and here's our second one. Again, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So give yourself a pat on the back because you've survived so far. What we're going to do now is we're going to neaten these edges in order that we can then have these ready for inserting in the next part onto the front and the back panel. So for now, what you can do is you can take these across to your sewing machine, and you can do a zigzag stitch along here. So again, I would start at the top tier. Let me just show you how I would do that if I was doing this. So I'm going to use my overlocker. But this is why we've not pressed these as we've been sewing them, because I wanted if you press them so that the seam is sitting up there, it's very easy, so that it's flat up towards the top, it's very easy to get the other layer caught in underneath. But whilst you've actually got it still as without being pressed, then that back section stays really good. So, and what I would suggest you do is have the flat panel, so the tier 1 in this case, against your machine bed, and then you're going to then put your stitch onto a zigzag stitch. So have a look, you've probably got a selection process like this. So this is my number 8 stitch, so I can change that then to number 8, and then it'll start to do the zigzag. But it's also got some my machine's also got some presets. So the width, the zig and the zag, the up and the down section is set at 5, and my stitch length is set at 2. And you want quite a deep zigzag because you want to, and fairly narrow, because you want to be able to catch all of this fabric, because it does fray quite easily. So what we can do again is, just before we start working on that one, we can have a look, go back to our test that we made of our gathered section. And if we just put that under our machine, we can just have a quick practice along the top of there. And we want to, I talk about it being zig and zag. You want your zig, your left hand stitch, to go into your fabric, but then you want your zag, your right hand stitch, to go just off the edge, or just a real smidge close to the edge. If it goes off the edge, it'll catch the ends here and stop them from fraying. Let me show you what I mean. Let me just get this started. And sometimes it might be beneficial just to let off your tension a little bit. Just as you're doing this stitch, it doesn't quite pull it quite so flat, so bunched up underneath. So let me just take that out, just because that's enough just to show you. And so what you're wanting is like here, where your zig and your zag go. So your zig goes into your fabric, your zag goes off the back. And obviously you'll be going through 2 layers. But what you can see is, if we then go back in, and we'll have some whiskers like this, but if we go in and just take those whiskers off, just close to the stitches, but just be careful not to go through your stitching thread that's your zig and your zag. Once those have all been neatened off, you can see that you can pull on that, and nothing really much is going to come out and is going to fray for you. And that's really important on these fabrics where they're just really quick to fray, like this. Look, and how it can really start to cut into the amount of fabric that you've got available. So just by neatening that really helps. So that's, once you've decided that, yeah, I'm actually happy with that, you can always increase the zig and the zag. And as I said, sometimes it's good to let off the tension, because it doesn't pull it over quite so much on the stitch. It doesn't quite pull it quite so far onto the back. Sometimes it can pull it quite far over. So just have a little practice to get your zigzag stitches right. As you're stitching, the swoosh becomes really important. So again, when you put your fabric under, you want to make sure you've just got this seam complete on the top, and that you've got nothing else that's folding under and getting stuck underneath your work. So just every now and again, just stop. And also the other thing, when you're doing these things, if you pull too tightly on your fabric, this straight bit here will try and fold up underneath. And you might find that you start stitching and then you become aware that you've actually stitched in part of the panel underneath, has got caught in underneath there. So try not to pull or drag on your stitching, just let it run through your fingers. And the best way is to sort of like take a length of seam line that you're going to neaten, hold it with your finger and your thumb, stitch down that, making sure that's right, and then reposition the next bit, swoosh it under, make sure it's all right, and then do the next bit, and then swoosh it under and do the next bit. And I would just work on the gap between tier 1 and 2 first, then between 2 and 3, then between 3 and 4, or 4 and 5, I've lost count, haven't I? But you get the gist. You're just trying to just, oh, I've got one further up here, that's why I hadn't started on number 1. But again, it's easy to get lost, but if you start on this basis and start and do the top one, you can then push that one behind and expose your next one, and then you're going to then be neatening that one as well. So that's what I would do if I was doing a zigzag stitch. You can use pinking shears, Just be careful when you're, so pinking shears are these. So these triangular bladed scissors. And when you cut with those across the top of your fabric, I'll just do it down the bottom here so you can see. You get these little triangles cut in your fabric like that. Oops, can't see very well, like that. And what that means is that each of these edges is a bias edge, and so it might fray in some places, but it won't fray all the way down. So they're a good option if you've not got a zigzag and your machine only does a straight stitch, so that's a good option for you to use. Just be careful when you're snipping to lift your fabric up to make sure that you've just got your seam, and hold the rest of the fibres down so that you can then snip with confidence and then move across. Don't try and snip through on top of your table or anything like that. You've really got to take your time and move along your seam really carefully when you're snipping to make sure that you're not snipping into any of your other fabric. If you do, you can use interfacing sometimes to patch something on, or you can sew a patch on, but ideally you're not going to do that, and you're going to ideally be really careful and not get any of those snips in there. But I'm going to get my overlocker out and I'm going to do that. So let's have a chat about how you can do it if you're going to use an overlocker. Okay, so I've got my overlocker all set up and I've got it chaining nicely. I've just changed my threads over and made sure that that's chaining nicely. And the light's very bright on here, so it's going to be difficult for you to see to some extent. Let's get rid of those old threads. But the process is pretty similar. The one thing that you've really got to be careful of when you are using an overlocker is of the blade. And there's a little blade that just sits down just here that slices off the fabric, the edge of the fabric, as you start stitching. So anything that falls in line of that blade is going to get cut off. It doesn't matter whether you mean to or not, or whether it's the middle of your garment or the end, it just will get cut off. So what you need to do then, the swoosh becomes even more important. So when you've got your fabric here, just make sure you've got your flat edge, which we're going to put down first down, okay, and the little notches on here tell me where the stitching line is going to be. I've got it set up for a 4 stitch overlock at the moment. You could argue it only needs to be a 3, but I don't know why, I just like it with a 4. Anyway, but even more important, you've got to watch out for this panel, this little bubble. Can you see that bubble just there that's forming? Because if I put my fabric through now, the edge of this bubble here is going to get sliced off because there's just pressure on that seam. So you've got to really be careful that as you go through and as you're doing this, you're doing just a few inches at a time, and that you stop and check all the time that you've not got anything underneath where you don't want it. And my overlocker's making a very funny noise. So just don't get distracted, don't go diving along it all. And just keep stopping and just keep doing that swoosh and keep it all over to the side. Because that'll give you a really nice finish on the edge of your stitching. It reinforces the seam as well because you get those extra rows of stitching along there, so that's really important too. And naturally, when we're hanging this now, this seam wants to sit up. So again, let's go on to the next one. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to fold it so that I've got my bottom of tier 2 now. Are we on? Yeah, and tier 3, and the top of tier 3, and just again, just manoeuvre this all the time so that you've got just the bit underneath it that you need. But as you can see, I'm just making sure that that doesn't fold under, because if it does, you've got a lot of unpicking to do to replace that section that has been damaged. Just keep checking all the time that everything's all lined up. So the safest option is to use a zigzag on your machine because that's much less risky, especially if you're a beginner. But if you've got an overlocker and you've been concerned about using it, then again, this is an ideal opportunity and an ideal project to get it out and to be working with it. And that's why I wanted just to demonstrate how to do this. And I will be overlocking all of mine. So go through all of the gathered edges on your tiers and do that. Don't do your long edges down the edges of your tiers. We're going to do that in a few minutes in the next section. But just for now, that's all that you need to be doing along there. Just go ahead and either zigzag or pink or neaten the edges so that you're not going to have these fraying fibres come off the edge when you are wearing or washing your garment. And then so once we've finished our overlocking or your zigzagging on your panels, then what we're going to do is go along to each one and we're just going to press that seam just to neaten those edges. Just press them just at the top of your seam, just over the edge. Come down to the next one. So we do all of the pressing straight first, and as I pull it you can see how that other section wants to come underneath. Can you see that? How that fold line wants to come up. It won't once it's got the weight of the skirt on it, but just make sure you put your fingers underneath and just make sure that stays down. So that's 2. So again, just along here, just pressing those edges and those stitches just to make sure they're all okay. Look, I've pressed a little bit up there, look. Just press it back down again if it wants to go up. Oops, my iron keeps tipping over. I think the first week I had it, it dropped off the work surface and it's got 2 little buttons at the end, one just there and then that one there's broken off. That's why it keeps tipping to one side. So I do just have to keep an eye on it. Then once you've done down all of the seams that you've just sewn to join those together, then we're just going to go back and we want to press them so that they are sitting up towards the top of the skirt. So press those up just to make sure they're staying right. Most of them want to go that way anyway, which is great. And we'll turn this over in a second and just press from the other side as well. But this will make sure that it'll go nicely when we put it onto our skirt. So again, just put a bit of pressure on the top tiers here and that will just make sure that's just all where it should be. And obviously this is much easier on a bigger ironing board. But that would mean moving everything, so I'm going to manage with this. And you'll do this on both sets of your skirt, both sides, your left and your right. And then all I'll do is turn that over and then just make sure we've got a nice intersection going on here between our panels. So here it's just not quite pulled out properly. So that's why we just go back in from this side, making sure the seam allowance is up towards the top of the skirt, and you can use your press cloth again if you want to. So just make sure everything all stays all nice. I haven't overlocked the bottom hem yet or zigzagged that on the bottom of the tier, and that's because I'm going to save that until it's all in one piece, and then I will, the skirt's complete, and then I will then go round once with the overlocker at that point just to fix that hem and just neaten that edge before my mum tries it on. If you think there's going to be quite a bit taken off the bottom, and I'm hoping not on this one, I'm hoping we've adjusted enough for the height of it anyway, then you could always leave that section until later and just leave your hem at the bottom as it is. So go ahead and do that for both of your skirt pieces, your side panels, and you should see that your overlocked or your zigzagged edges are all staying up towards the top of your skirt, and then you can put that to one side for the moment because we have then finished with this section, the side tiers, and next we're on to the front and the back panel. So I'll just turn the camera around and then we'll get on to doing the next section. So I hope you've enjoyed stitching along with me today. We've now got 2 very lovely tiered side panels ready for attaching into the centre and the centre back of our dress in order then to make it into a complete round. And hopefully that was going to be the bit that you thought was going to be the scariest, maybe working with all that fabric and doing all the gathering and then attaching all the tiers together. But hopefully by breaking it down into smaller sections for you and then us working through it together, then hopefully it's gone really well for you. I'm really hoping it has. So I'm going to wrap this one up today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll see you next for the next part where we'll be attaching the centre and the centre back panel to our tiered skirts. Take care everybody, happy stitching, bye.